Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, we begin by talking with author Omar Zahzah. Omar is the author of a book that'll be out later this month on the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press titled Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle, with a foreword by Stephen Saleda. Omar Zahzah, for those of you out there that don't know, Omar is a writer, poet, and organizer of Lebanese Palestinian descent and assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies at San Francisco State University in California. He has covered digital repression in relation to Palestine as a freelance journalist since May 2021, with work appearing in such outlets as Al Jazeera, Middle Eastern Eye, Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, and Counterpunch, among many others. Omar Zahzah, welcome to the Project Censored Show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Omar, it's an honor to have you here. This book has been a long process for you. It is also on a very difficult subject, and I think you've done an amazing job navigating and clarifying a lot of issues associated with what's been happening around the issue of Israel and Gaza. Obviously since October 7 from 2 years back, but it's a much, much longer story than that, as we know, as you certainly know. And I think a good place to start, Omar, is tell us about what led you into this particular angle and subject specifically around this issue. And, you know, part of the process of you looking at this, what's happening right now from this angle.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's a really good one because it helps set up exactly how the book came to be. I think right now, rightfully, when we think of Palestine, we think of the current genocide in Gaza, and also that is, of course, impacting the West Bank and historic Palestine as well. Palestinians, can't get reprieve wherever they are under this kind of latest onslaught of settler colonial violence. But, really the inception of Terms of Servitude began in a much different moment, which was the immediate aftermath of, I'd say, around May 2021. Some of your listeners may recall during this period, you started to see resistance to the impending expulsion of Palestinians from the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And this moment, of course, it kind of followed, the George Floyd uprisings in 2020, which kind of primed us, I think, culturally and globally for broader conversations about systemic oppression, about white supremacy, about racism, in ways that we hadn't seen so frankly addressed in mainstream corners, before. And so I think that all of that kind of precipitated this dynamic where the fighting against the odds in this way for Palestinians was met with kind of an unexpected result, which is that the narrative started to shift, right? People started to think about Palestine in relationship to a broader system of oppression and subjugation, rather than some of the more familiar media tropes that we see, about, quote unquote terrorism, about Israel as this imperiled, innocent bastion of democracy. We started to see younger social media and media savvy Palestinians in general really intentionally use digital platforms in addition to other forms of media to advance the narrative and challenge the narrative that up until this point had really dehumanized Palestinians, of course continues to do so. But they basically affected kind of a crack in that narrative armature. And so Terms of Servitude really in its inception began in response to that, because it's in 2021, up to beginning of, I guess, 2022, you also start to see another angle, which is that for the first time, global media, global legacy media, I should say, pays attention to the censorship practices of big social media platforms, because Palestinians are being censored en masse, right? And posts about Sheikh Jarrah, about incursions into Al-Aqsa Mosque, about the then bombing of the Gaza Strip were being censored at an enormous collective rate that had not really been seen before. and it just became its own beat of journalism because of that. And so, it was the first time that these companies were held to task and had to sort of account for their practices. And so, of course, they started to make excuses like, well, we had a glitch. And of course, it's our first entry point into this kind of widespread process of censorship that is at times algorithmically trained, at other times it's sort of up to human discretion. But of course, the exact processes of how each company does it is opaque. We start to get a little window into that, and it's Palestine and Palestinian resistance that gets us there. So the book began in response to that. And I started to also think about how we've had a lot of wonderful interventions about technology in relationship to racism, how technology and newer platforms have this propaganda or this kind of narrative of upending old systems, through their own kind of dynamic brilliance and through their ability to create a new kind of counter-hegemonic democratic space. But in reality, they perpetuate the very systems they're supposed to be challenging. And it just seemed to me that even as there is a lot of writing about Palestine, there hadn't been as much of a sustained engagement with how technology racializes Palestinians in a particular way. And I felt that the way that they're silenced on social media is an example of that needs to be talked about and addressed at length, because it's something we can often take for granted since these are such familiar platforms. But at the same time, the fact that an entire group of people is effectively silenced a priori is an inherently discriminatory mode of design. And it's clear that at this point, these big tech companies are kind of taking the baton and running from what legacy media had initially started.
So Omar, let's address a couple of the concepts that you have going in right out of the gate in the book. You talk about refusing the language of silence. So I thought maybe you could unpack that for us briefly. And then I want to jump into a phrase, of course, that you use that you have as an analytical, process, and that is digital settler colonialism, right? So we want to unpack those couple of things before we get more into the book. So tell our audience a bit about those two things, if you could, Omar Zahzah.
Yeah, definitely. So that actually naturally leads me to the second moment that the book emerges in response to, which, as you know, is the latest genocide in Gaza. Because, I initially conceived of and pitched the book to the censored press, right? I believe around the end of 2021, maybe start of 2022. But at that time, it was really designed to be kind of an analysis based on some previous journalistic work about how Palestinians are silenced on digital platforms. But within this context of, as we saw with Sheikh Jarrah, with what became the Unity Intifada of Palestinians kind of affirming this collective identity, with the Manifesto of Dignity and Hope in a way that we hadn't seen in terms of a collective political Palestinian identity since probably the emergence of the kind of modern liberation struggle in the 1960s with the rise of the Palestinian Revolution at that time. But so all of that's to say, there was a lot of repression, but there was also this very hopeful tone, sense, I'd say, as well. Then, as I'm working on the book, you start to get the emergence of the latest genocide. And I think for me, there was this sense of not knowing how to move. First and foremost, wanting to attend to things, in a way that felt as materially supportive as possible, but also downplaying my own work or writing, not wanting to center myself essentially. And so for a while, I couldn't continue working on that book. But then what started to happen is, as it horrifically came into focus that this genocide was not going to be intercepted by any of the so-called democratic powers, was in fact going to be allowed to continue, and that many of us who are organizing, who are speaking out, needed to prepare ourselves for kind of the long game in terms of our actions. I realized we need to show up however we can, wherever we are, use whatever platforms are at our disposal. And so, that led me to think that it's important to continue what I started, if only just to be one more voice that's kind of, decrying this horrific assault, this horrific continuation of a decades-long settler colonial process of dispossession. And that really was what I meant by refusing the language of silence. The silence was every email I couldn't respond to when I was commissioned to write or to speak about something, or every piece that I just couldn't get myself to fill, to add to the page. It was all of that. That was the language of silence, and I realized that I needed to refuse that as part and parcel of continuing to raise my voice alongside many others against this genocide and for the total liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, as many of us have done, even prior to this most horrific moment.
So Omar Zahzah, I'm speaking with you. It's September 4. This show will air across the country next week. Just to give listeners a sort of heads up into context, because things change sometimes very quickly. Just recently, in the last couple of days, the BBC, of all places, which hasn't been always friendly and transparent about the reporting of what's going on in the area. There's a bias going on in many of these outlets, as you know. The International Association of Genocide Scholars states that Israel's conduct meets the legal definition as laid out in the UN Convention on Genocide. I know that people have been doing all kind of rhetorical, mental, linguistic, and semantic acrobatics trying to avoid the term or define it away and distract and divide and so on. Yet there seems to be more and more organizations, scholars, including people who were very sympathetic to Zionists' ideology. And we're going to unpack the anti-Semitism bit later, the tropes that are used to silence people. Right. But I'm curious to see, since you've been writing this book, that progression has also been taking place. So, and I know that we talked earlier a bit about some, quote, hopeful things. How do you see that? How do you see that progression? And do you think that this is going, are we coming to a tipping point? Where do you see any of that based on your work and research? Because clearly the military industrial sort of, big tech complex, the whole surveillance culture, that's a juggernaut that goes on seemingly unabated, right? But yet public sentiment has turned. Global sentiment certainly is opposing what's happening. But now we see even so-called, quote, mainstream or, major organizations and institutions basically saying what's going on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's interesting. We were talking about this earlier, kind of scaling back a little bit. This morning I was rereading one of the essays that I cite in the book in terms of Servitude, which is Edward Said's Permission to Narrate. And a lot of us will cite this piece as, especially for that iconic phrase, the denial of permission to narrate. That's what the legacy media has done and continues to do to Palestinians. But what I found also interesting going back over it is that in this piece, from the 80s, right? Said is talking about how there is this particular narrative about Israel as this democratic bastion that can do no wrong. And Western media spends a lot of time and energy manufacturing and disseminating this narrative. But when he talks about and starts to kind of tease out the different views that comprise this narrative, he has this sentence, quote, "Naturally, I refer here to official or policy effective views and not the inchoate, unfocused feelings of the citizenry, which, to judge from several polls, is unhappy about Israeli actions," end quote. And so I just found this, for lack of a better word, to be such a trip going back, and looking at this essay, because all the way from the 80s, you have somebody who's talking about, not just somebody, Edward Said, talking about how the media manufactures these narratives and doesn't really, in complete disregard of what the public may actually think. There's always been the sense that these narratives that are produced by legacy media and that are, that enforce the actions of the broader military industrial complex operate independently from actual public desires, right? From feelings, from senses of justice, of right and wrong. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, because sometimes we can get so focused on how stacked against us all of the institutions are, right? The military industrial complex, the bottom line of the military industrial complex, the bottom line of US imperial policy. That's what's always going to dictate the ultimate messaging that comes out of the media. And yet at the same time, the fact that they promote these narratives does not necessarily mean that there has been a complete capture of public hearts, minds, and opinions, right? And so I think we really need to remind ourselves of that, because that can even start to work against some of the defeatism that we feel. As far as more institutions, calling this what it is, which is a genocide, I think a lot of that is emerging from just the inability to deny the latest images that we've been seeing. There's a danger even in that too, though. So for example, I'm thinking about what's often condemned as, the famine. And of course, it is mass starvation. It is lethal starvation, but it's imposed starvation. And so I think it's important to not, some people I think are doing this kind of as a rhetorical move where they say famine in the context of a just general humanitarian catastrophe, where they get to talk about how badly they feel as though they're actually condemning, something. But in reality, they're not laying the blame squarely at the feet of the Israeli colonial project of the state, which is where it belongs. So we also need to be careful about support that is not really support, insofar as it doesn't actually implicate the perpetrators, right?
Yeah, well,
Or talk
corporate
about the
media,
actual
they
thing.
love to they love to use passive voice construction, framing, both sidesing, anything they can do to not say what's actually going on. Like I mentioned earlier, the acrobatics, right? The extraordinary effort to not say the thing. It's
Exactly.
and the whole, and we've talked about this on this show repeatedly. The whole look, there's lots of problems with social media, all the platforms, but TikTok was specifically targeted as a Chinese-owned company that, well, I guess that means they can't technically control it as easily or influence it. But, people like Mitt Romney and others in Congress and so forth, they said the quiet part out loud. They said, yeah, but the reason we're really trying to censor and get rid of TikTok is because of their coverage of Gaza and Palestine. And a whole generation of young people are seeing this happen and they're being radicalized around it. And then they're punishing the students, and then they're punishing institutions for people behaving in ways that they've been taught to be ethically, morally, in terms of social justice and historically. And then they're going to go after TikTok. But they say why out loud. That's the remarkable thing. It's not because of addiction. It's not because of all kinds of other distractions. It's because of this issue, right? And I think that's very interesting because it's going after TikTok as part of the tech world, but at the same time, it's that same tech world that is making it more possible to efficiently exterminate people in Gaza.
Exactly. I mean, it's just this unbelievable irony. I mean, what do you do with it, really? But I mean, I also, I found the TikTok situation to, I don't know what the word is for it, really. I don't know if it's laughable. I don't know if it's infuriating. I don't know if it's predictable. It's all of those things. But of course,
It's not even shooting the messenger. It's attacking the machinery. It's like you know what I mean? It's like the vehicle or something.
exactly. I mean, there's so much going on there. I mean, the imperial, competitive aspect to the whole thing, right?
Oh,
Like
yes.
targeting this, this Chinese company, like, these fear-mongering narratives. Oh no, the Chinese Communist Party is going to have all of your data,
They're
right? So it's this
dividing
kind
us,
of
Omar. They're
dystopian.
dividing us.
And at the
And
same time,
Putin too. We don't
of
divide
course,
ourselves. Our
no,
corporate
no,
media doesn't propagandize us. It's the others.
yes, exactly. And when we're not consuming the corporate media like good little citizen subjects, right? Like, we can't think for ourselves, and we're totally at the whims of these like nefarious actors. That's exactly
Mhm.
what's going on.
Uh,
But all of this is, TikTok itself, it's an independent company. It's concerned with its own success. It didn't create itself to be the pro-Palestine app. The fact that you have all this content that is going viral is, one, because of the savviness of the users, and also because of certain things like, yes, demographically, who's more likely to use it. It's, following kind of a newer direction in social media usage, which is kind of moving beyond this predominantly text-based,
yeah. When
setup.
it's also
Right?
obviously information that's live, it's live streamed, that's blacked out of the corporate and establishment media that further debases public trust in media.
Exactly. Exactly. And so the effectiveness of messages that are being spread on a platform was the whole reason to launch, this witch hunt, essentially.
Yeah.
And of course, it doesn't hurt that, the terms of the attack were to have it sell to a parent company. So of course, you're just bolstering, platform capitalism at that point.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, it brings me back. I realized I didn't answer the second question about digital settler colonialism. And so in the book, I'm very clear about the fact, right, I'm not the first person to use this term. I build on previous scholarship that thinks of digital settler colonialism as a framework for understanding how physical processes of settler colonialism, right, the dispossession and extermination of native peoples as part and parcel, of the larger process of colonizing or settling a land, right, extends to the digital sphere. So the phrase existed, well prior to my writing this book. But what I wanted to do was to rework it a little bit to especially emphasize how the forms of digital settler colonialism that we are seeing being weaponized against Palestinians occur as a result not just of one actor, but of collaboration, essentially collaboration between the imperialist US big tech company and the Israeli settler colonial state. We're seeing a convergence of their interests. And so for me, that meeting point, that convergence is an essential component of what I understand to be digital settler colonialism and its implications for Palestinians. Because what we're seeing in terms of the directions of big tech, in terms of its complacence, its collaboration with the military industrial complex, with the Israeli state, is not inevitable. It's by no means a done deal. It's the result of a series of choices that have been and continue to be made in order to fortify a bottom line at the expense of all else, including human rights, including the collective well-being of Palestinians and people at large.
Omar Zahzah, Stephen Saleta penned the foreword for your book, Terms of Servitude. And our listeners may remember Saleta from his own struggles in academic freedom around teaching about Israel, Palestine. He's professor of English and comparative literature at American University of Cairo now, had to teach there. But this brings up a really important issue around academic freedom and teaching about this. And it also opens up the other can of worms that when you talk about and criticize Zionism as an ideology and criticize the right-wing Likud party in Israel, that is not necessarily, and in your case, certainly not at all, driven by any anti-Semitic sentiments, right? But yet that's the trope over and over and over. Any critics of Israeli policy or action gets lumped in to this anti-Semitic idea. And now we even have bills and they're trying to pass laws to make it illegal to criticize Israel. Again, your thoughts on this, maybe even allude a bit to Saleta and what made him an interesting person to write the foreword in this regard. And of course, maybe as much as you want, this is a very real threat going on in higher ed right now. I know people personally that are colleagues that have been directly targeted over this issue.
Yeah, a lot to work with there. So feel free to also kind of nudge me back on track as I'm going to go. And if I go into some delicious kind of tangents here.
No, we've got a few minutes. We've got about 6 minutes. So go ahead.
Perfect. Well, first and foremost, I mean, having Saleta write the foreword was such an honor. And, I've known his work for years. I'll get into the academia industry issues in just a second, but just want to note that he is one of the really foremost scholars that was putting the question of Palestine and Arab American literature in conversation with indigenous studies, and so I followed his work, his literary criticism, his theorizations for years. He was one of my reference points when I was thinking of my own academic career, and still is in many ways. So having somebody like that write the foreword of your book is, it's something that you just can't describe, right? But many people will know Saleta for 2014 when he was fired by the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for his tweets condemning the Israeli assaults on Gaza. And, that was an act that was very much done. It was discovered at the behest of donor pressure. So it became one of the standout cases for, the nature and the limits of academic freedom, under a context in which support for Zionism is very much normalized. And as you say, Mickey, part of this narrative includes the idea that criticism of the state of Israel, of Israeli policy, is inherently anti-Semitic. And we've seen decades, for years, the same attempts to pass legislation, policies that amount to the same thing, a false equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Sometimes what you'll also have, which I think it's also important to be critical of, is these ostensible defenses of academic freedom that still kind of take this false conflation for granted. So people will sometimes say things like, well, we should support, free speech. So it doesn't matter if people are anti-Semitic, and they mean people who speak out about Palestine. There is no inherent equation between support for Palestine and anti-Semitism. It's important to challenge that as a fiction on its face, right? And so, but this is a very persistent narrative. And I think part of it is also because it interfaces very nicely with a tendency that people can sometimes have to assume that centrism automatically means objectivity. And so people who may not know very much about this topic, or who may just read the headlines about, campus protests, may just automatically assume both sides are wrong. So the wrong of this one side must be that they're kind of bigoted, but they should still have freedom of speech, right? No, we need to challenge the entire fiction on its face and say, right, there is no inherent equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israeli policy, criticism of the project of Zionism as such, which I argue it is important to do as well, is not rooted in anti-Semitism. It's rooted in an ethos of anti-colonial liberation and collective equality for all people.
So Omar Zahzah, we have a few minutes left, and I know I want you to be able to share with our listeners places that they can read more, any other stuff you want to share with our audience so that people can follow more of your work. Or I know you're doing several events. You're going to be with me at Ithaca is Books, right? For example, September 11 and 12, you'll be at the book festival here. I know you have some other events in the Bay Area. Maybe you can mention some of those if you want to. But just before we do that, I know you wanted to address some issues around social media and the subject that you're writing about. And that's just one thing we could throw out. But is there anything else in the couple minutes we have left that you'd like to address? Maybe that's one. Perhaps there's another. I mean, it's a dense book. It's a couple hundred pages, 260 pages, right? So there's a lot in here, extensively noted. But Omar Zahzah, something you want to tag on here for the last couple minutes?
Thank you so much. I think the last thing I'll say is, when I was writing this book, it was a constant struggle to not be too outdated, because there were so many new facts on the ground just emerging in real time. And you'll see this in the introduction. There's aspects of it that are dated from when I submitted it to now. But I think more broadly speaking, it's really important for us to understand that although I do believe that social media censorship of Palestinians deserves its own sustained form of engagement and understanding of how it is a process of racialization, it's also just the latest outgrowth of how dominant media industries collude with the military-industrial complex. All of which is to say that within the next few years, there's going to be no doubt a new form of mass censorship on a different form of media that we are talking about, because at the end of the day, we want to remain tied to the broader paradigmatic issue, which is that we're seeing the collusion between the media industry, the military-industrial complex, and imperialism at large. And so these types of censorship, they'll be unique in terms of the form they take at a moment in time, but the broader dynamic is always going to be there. So we always have to keep speaking out.
Yeah, very, very well put. Could not agree more. Omar Zahzah, where can people follow your work or find out more?
So you can find me on the app formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Dr. Omar Zahzah. I'm on Instagram at Omar Zahzah and Facebook as well. I am also on Bluesky, Omar Zahzah. You can find me there. I just started that account. But I would say, for the most part, keep a lookout in outlets like the Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, and Palestine Chronicle, which are the places that I began a lot of what became the content that, we can now hold in our hands as terms of servitude. And for those who are going to be in New York, I look forward to seeing you in person.
So, Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and the Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle is out later in September from the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press. And I wanted to give a couple shout outs. One to Andy Lee Roth, our colleague at Project Censored that I know you work with closely, and Shaylee Voidal, and also, of course, Nora Barris Friedman, who drew attention to your really important and significant work. And by the way, those of you looking for Omar Zahzah online, the last name is spelled Zahzah. So you'll have an easier time looking that up. Omar Zahzah, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know the semester is beginning and there's a lot going on, and your book will be out this month and you're going to be traveling around. So be on the lookout for Omar Zahzah and Terms of Servitude. Omar, thanks so much for joining us on the Project Censored Show today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.